Civil War soldier's ID tag. That's an iron trigger guard. That's a cap bust half on. I just dug this. Oh.
This North Carolina button is only one of two examples known. It's a rare North Carolina starburst that was dug in a Confederate cavalry camp here in Stafford. The Shaler bullet. It's a multi-piece bullet. It's designed to come apart and flight. And the inventor said it made one man equal to three because this bullet the first piece would drop off at a distance, and the second piece and the third piece, and it helped making up for overestimating or underestimating your range. It's a multi-piece that comes apart. They also had the rare 4-piece, which is right here, and there's only 10 of them known in existence. The other bullet that you find a lot here in Stafford was the Gardner explosive. They were issued to the 11th Corps here in Stafford before Chancellorsville, and they're made of pewter, they're not made of lead. And the reason is being, when they would explode, lead would just swell. The pewter will fragment in many pieces. And that had a fuse in it in a little copper vessel. And Stonewall Jackson, when he overran the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville, they captured around 10,000 rounds of them, and they took them to Gettysburg. So both sides had them at Gettysburg. But after Gettysburg, when they realized the horrific wounds that these bullets made, they signed an agreement between the two armies not to use them anymore. Another thing that people don't realize during the Civil War, they had mechanical pencils and they had fountain pens. There's an example of some of them. It's just something you don't think of. You think of lead pencils, and the soldiers would also roll lead from melted bullets to make their own pencils, because you can write with lead on paper. Partial plates. You see the teeth, silver. They were porcelain teeth with silver. They had partial plates during the Civil War. They came into camp. It's something you don't think of. Most all the camps we hunt, you find wedding bands. The wedding bands for the average man in those days were brass. They weren't gold, because the average person couldn't afford gold wedding bands. So you find lots of wedding bands in the camps. And our theory has always been that from the soldiers losing the weight and everything, that they'd lose the rings in the camp. Another thing, right before the Civil War, Goodyear invented rubber. So it became a fad during the Civil War to smoke rubber pipes, which had to taste nasty. But you had clay pipes, but you had rubber pipes too that you find in the camps, normally when you're digging out pits. Lice combs haven't changed in 200 years. They're all the same. A lot of people have claimed that they didn't have harmonicas in the Civil War, but every camp you go into, you dig harmonica reeds. They had to have them. There's no other explanation for it. And the cavalry ride through with their swords and strike down. They protected your collarbone from getting broke. The soldiers hated them. They were hot. They were awkward to walk around with, so they conveniently threw them away. Towards the end of the war, they stopped even issuing them because they wouldn't wear them. But the original purpose for them was to protect your collarbones and your shoulders from sword. The insignia was worn was to help the communication of who was who. Your Jeff Davis pin and your bugle were for infantry, cross sabers, of course, for cavalry. The artillery had the cross cannons, and the engineers wore the castle. Along with that, you got an example like this one here. NHV was stood for New Hampshire Volunteers. The 9 meant you were 9th Regiment, Infantry, Company B. The Union Army, if you go in their camps, had vast amounts of glassware. The Confederate Army evidently did not have access to it because you did very few glass bottles at Confederate camps. But this is just a variety of what they had. They had soda pop, in mustard jars, and different sauces. And some of the sauce companies became big during the Civil War. Lee and Perrin, Worcester, and all that. They made sauces to cover up the taste of the food, and the sutlers would sell it to the soldiers. And that's how they really became big. Money during the Civil War. The expression hard cash comes from the fact that coin money was more valuable than the paper money because it had a universal value. The problem those days with the states printing the money was there would always be arguments. Is a dollar from Virginia worth as much as a dollar from New York? And they would bicker back and forth. But coin money had a constant value no matter where you was at because of silver, gold, copper. In those days, merchants were allowed to cut coins to make change. So if you went into a store and bought a nickel's worth of goods and gave them a dime, they would cut that dime in half. And they would keep half and you'd keep half. That was a standard practice in those days. They had what was called merchant shears, and they could cut pie sections out of coins, which where the old cheer 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar, because a dollar was 8 bits. And it started in colonial times. but it carried all the way through the Civil War. Out front, we've got the pie-shaped coins that were cut. So they were so poor. That's a nickel, a paper nickel, because the metal was such short supply. At the beginning of the war, they did target practice in volleys. So they would take anywhere from 100 to 300 men and put them on the line and all shoot at the same target at the same time. So they never know who hit what. It was very hard for them to adjust their sights. What they were basically doing is getting you used to the rhythm of loading your cartridges and firing your gun, because so many of the people were city people who had never fired guns before. So with a muzzle-loading gun, it's a process that you have to go through many steps. So they're getting you used to that process. This is all cavalry stuff and horse accoutrements. Picket pins is what they would tie the horses to. It basically works like the same type of device you tie your dog in your backyard. You drive it in the ground and tie the reins of the horse to the little hook, and it would spin as the horse grazed, and that would keep him in place. These are examples of some of the Union type of plates here. The ones on the bottom are 4-piece rifleman's buckles. These particular ones came out of the 9th New Hampshire camp. They were a French design. They were used early in the war, and towards the later of the war, they were inefficient because they put too much strain on the soldiers. So they discontinued them. But most people are used to regular eagle plates. Let's see, you had eagle plates. They had eagle plates that they used for belt buckles with the regular hooks in them. Some of them were NCO plates. So there's a wide variety of uses. The bottles just shows you an example of some of the different kind of bottles you dig in the camps. Some people say that the soldiers didn't have access to the whiskey. Well, this proves different. Top row is whiskey bottles. You've got champagne bottles in the back lower row. The two-tone brown ones are ginger beer. Black ones are mostly gin. So alcohol was a big commodity in the camps, basically because they had a lot of free time and a lot of recreational use. These fireboxes were dug out of the hut site, and everything was put back together exactly the way it came out the hut site, so you'd see how they created them. They used some type of stone or brick, whatever was handy, to line the base of it, and the chimneys were mostly wood and mud. They had a lot of chimney fires, especially in the middle of the night in those days. And also the soldiers would play pranks on each other. In the middle of the night, some guards would take their coat and throw it over top of somebody's chimney in the middle of the night and smoke them out. Or they would drop a handful of bullets down the chimney. That was recorded. There was one general in the 5th Corps was going to be leaving, so his men has a surprise to him. Took a hollow log and filled it full of gunpowder, and it stopped it up. So when he was burning his wood in the middle of the night and threw the log on the fire, it exploded. And he was not too happy about that. He did not see justice in the joke. This is where the huts were built. When they came, the soldiers each had a section of cloth, shelter half, ground cloth, whatever. And you didn't want to be laying on the ground for 5 or 6 months when you're in the winter camp. So what they did is they dug holes down and cut whatever wood they had or stripped houses, put wood on the sides, and threw their ground cloth over top of it for a roof. Now, this way they could walk around, stand up, get dressed. They averaged 4 men to a hut would have lived in the winter. Each one had its own firebox and chimney, both for heat and for the fact that you were responsible for cooking your own rations. They didn't have mess halls. So they mostly got the bricks from the houses in the area. They'd tear people's chimneys off and pull up the sidewalks, and that's what they used to create the firebox. They had a lot of chimney fires and stuff during the camp because as the wood would dry out in the chimneys, they would have a tendency to catch fire. Here's a actual photograph of what a camp would look like, how it was laid out. This is the 15th New York Engineers down here on the creek. And as you can see, the camps were well organized. It was a regulation camp. They had streets companies. You had your headquarters on one end, you had your commissary on the end, and you had your hospital on the other end. And so it was laid out basically like a little town. And sometimes they would have to move, 2 or 3 times if they would exhaust the supply of wood, and they'd just trash up the area too bad. They'd be required to move camp. Sometimes they'd move a short distance, sometimes they might move a mile or 2 away. And some poor individuals would get assigned to an area, they'd dig in, build the camp, and the next day they'd get orders to leave. So they'd have to tear everything back down and go start all over again. These shoes were preserved, they came out the mud. They were all leather, and the problem in those days was tractions. So they made heel plates and toe plates, and this is what gave you your traction. Basically, they looked like little horseshoes. I remember growing up and finding them in the fields, and I thought that's what I thought they were, baby horseshoes. And my granddaddy would tell me, "No, you idiot, they're went on boots." But this is what would give you, your soldier, your traction to walk on the wet leaves in the mud. Melted bullets. When the ammunition was damaged or they were moving out, a lot of times they were ordered to destroy the ammunition. So that's why you find the bullets in the fireboxes. Some camps would dig a big hole on the edge of the camp and bury them deep. I had a friend of mine find 4,200 rounds in one hole that had been buried of different calibers. But they would just throw the excess bullets to destroy them, and when they left out of here, they burnt the huts down. So a lot of these melted bullets you find have been destroyed or coming out at the huts. Early in the war, a lot of the states made their own plates and buckles. S&Y stands for State of New York. VMM is Volunteer Maine Militia. These flaming cannonballs was Hawkins Zouaves. And the square ones up here were buckles for the drummer boy. You carried your drumsticks in them, because in those days everything was done at the beat of the drum. So you had to have access to your drumsticks in a hurry when you got your orders, so that they would be able to pull them out there and start the beat of the officer's orders. The youngest soldier we can document was a drummer boy who was 10 years old. His name was Johnny Clem. After the war, when he got older, he received a commission to West Point and went on to become a brigadier general in World War I. This was taken found in a hospital site. This is a piece of a soldier's hip. You can see where the surgeon sawed the hip out, and that's the bullet that fractured his hip, stuck right in the bone. It's a good chance he probably died because they didn't understand germs during the Civil War. The Union medical manual said a good, clean, healing wound would have pus coming out of it. So when you're in the hospital every day, they check your wound for pus. If you didn't have pus in your wound, they'd go to somebody else, take pus out of them, come back and insert it inside of you. They thought that was a sign of healing. They had about a 40% infection rate in Union hospitals. The Confederate hospitals only had about a 10% infection rate. And one of the reasons was because of the lack of supplies, they had to use what was on hand. So for sutures, they were cutting the tails off horses and horsehair for sutures. And for bandages, they were using cotton, because that was the mainstay of the South. But to make the hair and the cotton pliable for surgery and medical use, they boiled it. When you boil it, you're sterilizing it. But they had no idea what they were doing. So they were using sterile surgical techniques in the South. One of the favorite weapons for the Confederate cavalryman was a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. That way you had 2 shots to your one, and it's a whole lot easier hitting something with a load of buckshot when you're on horseback galloping across than a single rifle bullet. And this one was carried by a gentleman in 9th Virginia Cavalry. This bullet on the far right is 69 caliber. It was made at the New Orleans Naval Labs for the Confederate government. It was made early in the war and it didn't work very well, so they discontinued them. The only other Confederate bullet that we can document was a 2-piece bullet normally associated with South Carolina troops, and it had a iron pin in the nose attached to a primer. And the idea was when the bullet was fired, the nose would hit and explode the bullet. But the problem that the Confederates had with them, when you're ramming it down the barrel, you're beating on the primer. So the bullets were exploding, going off while the guys were ramming right the ramrods, blew their own fingers and hands off. So what the soldiers were doing, they were taking the bullets apart, taking the explosive charge out, and use them as a regular bullet. And that's a cutaway of a regular exploding bullet like the Union Army had, and you can see how it was hollow. And that was where the explosive charge went. Another thing that people don't realize they had, and a lot of times they find them with YAR, is these water filters. They knew that drinking contaminated water would make you sick. So they came out with these water filters. And what you would do is you would take charcoal from your campfire and you fill the back of it in. And most of them had a little rubber hose attached to it. So you could stick that filter in the water, you could suck on it, and the charcoal would purify the water. The problem they had with it is they made the filters out of pewter. And pewter contains arsenic and lead. So you ingested arsenic and lead every time you suck on it. It was a good idea, just a wrong material. If they used brass, everything would have been fine. But these are water filters to combat the dysentery and the disease they were getting in the camps. They also had water filter canteens where you'd fill up the one end, and then they had the filter built right in the canteen where you could suck out of it and help purify the water. I always thought these were neat. These are mid-air collision bullets. Most of them that are found, you see, come from target ranges or a piece of wood. These are bullets that struck in mid-air. So I always contended there were 2 lucky men that day. They're very rare to find. And this is just a different shrapnel that they would put anything they could, iron balls, lead balls, bullets, whatever they had on hand inside the exploding ordnance to create the shrapnel effect. And this is an example to show you how the bullets would open up when they went through you. The soft lead would break bones and just tear through flesh. That's why the Geneva Convention later on in the late 1800s, they banned solid lead bullets. Nowadays everything's metal, steel jacketed or metal jacketed to make the wounds less severe. The roads were so bad in the wintertime here that there's actually messages where they were losing mules and horses up to their ears in the mud because the roads would get so bad. So what they had to do to get supplies to the troops is it was called corduroy them. You could see they would cut trees, lay them down, and then plank them with other trees. They'd put brush on top of them and then a foot of dirt on top of that. And that would keep the wagons up where they'd only sink a few inches in the mud. And there was tens, if not 100 miles of these they built all through Stafford so they could supply the troops while they were here. And like I said, that's a photograph. This ran beside the original track at Stoneman Station, but over the years when they built the roads, the state covered it up and it was dug out.
Lost my tablet and cell phone.
These huts were recreated from the dimensions from the actual huts that we dug out, and from photographs and wartime descriptions of the soldiers of how they built them. So there was no right or wrong way to build a hut. It depended on what materials you had at hand and what your fancy was. But these huts are all recreations. This is exactly what would look like when you walked into a Civil War era camp. These bricks are all original Civil War bricks that got hauled out the woods to come up here to make it. And we made it just the way they did. Dug into the back, took a cast iron stove and mounted it in the back for your firebox. That created the heat for your oven. And then on top of that, they had a smaller one for your coffee. So you could build a fire either place. You have one just for coffee and one for baking.